In the autumn of 1908, the mist clung to the ridge above Blackwood Valley until noon. The air was thick, carrying the damp weight of the Pacific Northwest. Martha Halloway walked the perimeter of her field. She was 58 years old. Her hands were mapped with the same soil she turned each season. She was the last farmer cultivating silver root on this land. The tuber was unremarkable to the eye, pale and knotted, but when ground into a wet paste, it stopped gangrene in its tracks. It pulled severed flesh back together in a matter of hours. The plant would grow nowhere else in the known world. It required the exact soil composition found at the base of the old giants. These trees stood 400 feet tall in places, their trunks so broad that 2 grown men could not join hands to circle them. Early government surveyors recorded them as living pillars. They could not match the bark texture or the vascular structure to any known species in the botanical catalogues. Elias Thorne filed his official survey notes in 1906. He wrote that the trunks appear to be stone, yet they breathe. He noted the ground grew warmer as the wind shifted through their canopy. The valley itself existed far beyond the timber roads, cut off from rail lines and telegraph wires. The Halloways had worked that slope since before the territory became a state, passing down the planting depth, the harvest window, and the exact ratio of ash to loam required for the crop. They understood the rhythm of the valley. They did not question why the soil hummed when it rained. That rhythm broke on a Tuesday morning in late October. A telegram arrived at the county courthouse carrying a federal condemnation order stamped by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The document overrode every state property law and homestead claim on record. It did not request an appraisal. It did not schedule a hearing. The language was absolute. Within 72 hours, federal marshals arrived with survey stakes and wire fencing. The Halloways were given 3 hours to clear the ridge. Martha refused to argue with the men in wool coats. She packed a single trunk of family ledgers and walked her daughter Ruth up the southern slope. From the high ground, she watched the valley floor transform. A procession of heavy Mack trucks climbed the rough tracks, their engines grinding through the low fog. They carried nothing but wet concrete in steel rotating drums. One by one, they aligned their chutes and poured continuous streams of grey slurry over the silver root beds and the exposed root flares of the giant trees. The cement buried the acre in days. Martha stood beside Ruth and listened to the machinery drown out the wind. What the Corps buried was not a farm, but a living frequency regulator. The curing process for that much mass concrete took nearly 6 months. While the county clerks recorded the Halloway deed as a standard federal acquisition, a different record was moving through the military postal system. It travelled from a forward operating camp outside Yakima to a climate-controlled storage room in Washington, D.C. The file slipped between a stack of Columbia River floodplain surveys and a series of timber yield maps. It remained uncatalogued for decades until a routine archival audit pulled it from its original sleeve. The manila folder bears a single stamped classification in faded red ink, CR9. That designation is never used for water rights or standard land seizures. It is reserved exclusively for geological surveys of deep subsurface structures that intersect with artificial foundations. The report was authored by Corps hydrologist Frank Calder. He was a methodical engineer trained in acoustic geology and hydrostatic mapping. He filed his preliminary findings exactly 1 year after the condemnation order. His handwriting is precise. His measurements are exact. His conclusion quietly rewrites the entire geological history of the valley. Calder did not send his drilling crews to collect surface soil. He dropped reinforced acoustic resonance probes into sealed boreholes and calibrated early electromagnetic seismographs to capture harmonic vibration beneath the basalt layer. The data he compiled reveals a structural anomaly that standard botany cannot reconcile. The silver root system did not terminate at the seasonal water table. The primary taproots descended through the volcanic rock, pushed past the ancient clay seams, and anchored themselves exactly 400 feet below the valley floor. At that depth, they interlocked with a naturally occurring resonant chamber of lasered granite. The modern archival index uses that exact term because the original borehole photographs show walls melted, fused and polished into flawless geometric curves by a directed thermal precision. Inside that sealed cavity, his equipment recorded a continuous standing wave. The pulse measured exactly 8.5 Hz. It did not fluctuate with groundwater shifts or distant heavy industry. It held steady. That exact frequency appears repeatedly in restricted early studies on the cymatic properties of megalithic architecture. Research that mapped how sustained low vibrations align stone blocks and transmit power across bedrock without conductive wire. Those papers were quietly withdrawn from public circulation and folded into classified engineering archives by 1912. The silver root was never a simple medicinal crop. It functioned as a biological tuning fork. The dense tuber mass and its sprawling underground vascular lattice modulated that 8.5 Hz pulse, bleeding off excess harmonic energy into the surrounding crust and preventing localized tectonic destabilization. Calder drew the connection explicitly in his marginal notes. He stated that removing the regulating root mass would allow the chamber amplitude to spike unchecked. The resulting vibration would fracture regional fault networks within months. The Army Corps understood the mechanism completely. They did not pour the mass to pave over agricultural land. They poured it as a calculated acoustic damper. The sheer weight and acoustic density of the mixture were engineered to absorb the standing wave and force the frequency to decay before it reached the surface. The primary chamber itself sits 1,200 feet beneath the valley floor, locked against a tectonic junction that predates human settlement. Frank Calder dated his final assessment to October 14, 1909. He recommended permanent surface sealing and classified the site as a dormant geological hazard. The recommendation was approved without debate. The Corps was not protecting public health or managing crop blight. They were systematically shutting down a remaining node of a global energy network that the modern age had chosen to forget. The Calder file was not an isolated administrative error. It was a single page pulled from a much larger operational ledger. When you trace the CR9 classification across early 20th century archives, you find the same suppression blueprint repeating across 3 continents. Blackwood Valley was only one node in a planetary circuit systematically dismantled between 1880 and 1945. In the foothills of the Caucasus, Russian imperial engineers mapped a dense cluster of ironwood groves in the autumn of 1912. The timber refused standard dendrochronology. The trunk stood in perfect geometric alignment along known seismic faults. Survey teams noted a continuous harmonic vibration passing through the wood. The Ministry of Railways issued an immediate land clearance order. Engineers planted dynamite charges along the route lines and detonated the forest in a single coordinated blast. The official report cited railway expansion. The seismic logs from the Tiflis Observatory recorded a sudden spike in crustal microfractures the moment the charges fired. The acoustic regulator had been broken. Moved south to the Mesopotamian marshes in the early 1920s. British Mandate authorities launched a massive drainage campaign targeting the southern wetlands. The operation was framed as agricultural reclamation and malaria control. The waters were diverted, the channels dried. Before the silt settled, colonial hydrologists documented thick beds of singing reeds lining the ancient river deltas. The plants produced a sustained resonance when wind passed through their hollow stems. Their acoustic signature matched the 8.5 Hz pulse recorded in the Pacific Northwest. Geophysicists attached to the Cambridge Engineering Corps noted the frequency stabilized local groundwater pressure and suppressed minor tectonic shifts. Within months, those research notes were stamped confidential. The marshes were drained. The reed beds suffocated in exposed mud. The Mandate classified the entire operation as public health infrastructure management. The terminology quietly masked the silencing of an acoustic grid. In 1934, the pattern reached the Yucatan Peninsula. Military surveyors identified vast fields of bloodroot growing in circular depressions carved into limestone karst. The plant exuded a deep crimson sap when exposed to direct sunlight. The sap contained metallic particulates unknown to modern chemical analysis. Federal authorities authorized a rapid land seizure. Within 3 weeks, transport brigades laid down a reinforced ferroconcrete slab over 400 acres. The project was logged as a military quarantine zone for crop testing. The soil beneath the platform held active root networks identical to the silver root system. Geologists measured ground resonance frequencies dropping by exactly 40% once the concrete cured. The findings were removed from open publication. The data was folded into restricted repositories where it remains misfiled. The timeline is precise. The method is consistent. State engineering bureaus, not private corporations, executed every suppression. They operated under legal covers like land reclamation, disease quarantine, or mineral development. They poured concrete, diverted water lines, and deployed explosives to extinguish biological interfaces that connected to deep earth resonances. The precursor culture that engineered these systems did not separate energy from terrain. They understood planetary power as a single living grid. Trees functioned as surface transducers. Roots acted as subterranean waveguides. Specific flora served as living dampeners and frequency modulators. The knowledge required to maintain that network was encoded in cultivation practices, planting geometries, and acoustic sequences passed down through families who worked those slopes. Martha Halloway knew what the concrete would do. In the final hours before the grading machinery broke the tree line, she pulled Ruth close and spoke a sequence into her ear. It was not a prayer. It was a set of precise pitches, measured pauses, and tonal intervals. A sonic key. Along with the sequence, she transmitted coordinates pointing to a specific junction beneath the valley bedrock, where the primary root mass intersected the granite chamber walls. Ruth carried that information out of Blackwood Valley. She later transcribed the frequencies and the coordinates into a leather ledger kept in an iron box. The journal vanished in the winter of 1923 during a property inventory dispute in Tacoma. Police records list it as stolen personal effects. Official genealogical records state Ruth perished in an influenza outbreak in 1919. The Holloway line ends there. Yet county land registries in central Washington tell a different story. In April 1947, a deed was recorded under the name of a single woman. Her birth year matches Ruth Holloway exactly. She purchased a 40-acre parcel of uncultivated hillside. The attached geological survey notes proximity to a documented subsurface resonance anomaly. The frequency reading matches the Blackwood baseline within a decimal point. The official record says the bloodline died. The land records say she moved closer to the hum. The concrete slab in Blackwood Valley remains intact. Federal survey markers from 1911 still sit rusted into the perimeter soil. No excavation has been permitted since 1910. The Army Corps maintains the land is classified exclusively for structural stability monitoring. The reality is quieter. They are guarding a failing acoustic damper. That engineered mass of reinforced cement and aggregate has sat under heavy seasonal rain, root pressure, and decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The material density required to suppress the 8.5 Hz pulse degrades naturally. Microfractures form. Water seeps into the cured matrix. The frequency trapped beneath the surface does not vanish. It seeks new pathways upward. If the concrete has compromised, the standing wave is already shifting through the bedrock. The proof rests in a locked archive. The Frank Calder report resides permanently in the Smithsonian Deep Archive. It carries a CR9 classification that triggers an automatic administrative block. Every formal request to access the document is denied under standard preservation protocols. Retrieving it requires a specific Freedom of Information Act override that has never been granted by the Oversight Bureau. The file is not misplaced. It is actively held in stasis. The Holloway bloodline, if it continues, carries the only method to bridge the gap between the surface and that sealed chamber. Martha did not pass down a folk remedy or a family myth. She transmitted a sonic sequence calibrated to resonate with the precise geometry of the lasered granite. The vocal intervals match the harmonic structure of the subsurface void. Without that exact sequence, the chamber remains acoustically isolated from the earth above. With it, the dampener could be bypassed. The network could be tuned. We are taught to see ancient engineering through the lens of broken stone and rusted metal. We assume their infrastructure relied on mechanical leverage and centralized combustion. The suppressed data points in the opposite direction. The system was entirely biological. Those broad trunks early surveyors recorded as living stone were not timber. They were natural transducers, engineered to capture atmospheric charge and ground it into specific geological strata. The silver root and its global counterparts were not agricultural crops. They were biological waveguides. They translated tectonic stress into stable harmonic vibrations and distributed planetary energy through interconnected root and mycelial networks. The people who cultivated them did not harvest power. They listened to it. They adjusted the pitch of the soil with precise planting geometries and vocal tonal maps. That knowledge was not buried because it posed a direct threat to the ruling powers. It was buried because it belonged to a planetary framework that made modern extraction obsolete. A civilization that draws energy directly from tectonic resonance and atmospheric harmonics has no need for strip mines, deep drilling rigs, or centralized grid infrastructure. It requires ecological stewardship. It requires patience. It demands a symbiotic relationship with the ground that industrial economies cannot tolerate. The engineers who poured the mass concrete understood this completely. They chose to sever the connection rather than learn to maintain it. They paved over the living interface and labeled the valley a dormant hazard to justify the permanent silence. Imagine the concrete now, decades heavier with time, cracking under the relentless weight of forest overgrowth. Pine roots pry into the split seams. The soil